Hello and welcome to SafeR Journeys. I am one of your hosts, Heather. We are here in North Central Illinois at our Safe Journeys agency, where we care for and provide prevention to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And I'm here with my colleague and supervisor and director of multiple programs, Melissa.
Hi, I'm the Community Engagement Director with Safe Journeys, and we are so happy to be doing this podcast dedicated to raising children, ending violence, and ending oppression. And it's coming into the holiday season, and so it's just kind of like extra special to say thank you right now for our listeners. And I'm just like so proud to have this podcast. I really am.
Yeah.
You know, like a lot of times I think of it as one of our prevention strategies, which it is.
It is for sure.
Yeah. But I'm also like, wow, we got it started.
We both really wanted to do a podcast. Like that was a big deal for us. Like when I first started, we talked about it a lot.
Yeah.
And it felt out of reach for a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was big. It was a big win and an exciting one, especially since we both enjoy listening to podcasts so much too.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, we're very grateful to have listeners, to have a platform to share this information. And actually, we decided, because we were so excited, that we're going to do a bonus episode coming up soon, where we just talk about a little bit about our background and how we got into this work and the things we love, the things that challenge us, because we haven't given the listeners really much of a background and insight into us as people and how we function in our work environments.
Yeah, that's very true.
And like so much of our history and purpose are just like left out, and I think it will help listeners understand where we come from.
Yeah, absolutely. Be an insight into the world of violence prevention, but also,
well, us as people, as parents, as you know, the multiple identities that we hold.
Yeah. Oh, I'm excited for that episode.
Me too. We won't have to prepare very much. We'll just show up.
It's so true.
All right.
So, trigger warning, we discuss topics of domestic and sexual violence. I want to be specific because I know in the past, like we say that, and then I think some other things come up. And I just want to make sure we know today's topic is about children and youth with disabilities. And so what that means for our trigger warning is that we will be discussing topics that relate to domestic and sexual violence in relation to children and youth with disabilities.
Yeah, this may be a particularly hard one to hear, especially if you're not familiar with the risks that young people face having a disability. So this may be a little bit of a gut punch.
Right.
So if you do need to take care of yourself or stop the episode or come back later, that's absolutely acceptable.
Yeah.
So like Melissa said, we are going to talk about children and youth with disabilities. I didn't realize how connected I would feel to this content until I was on my way here. And I was like, oh, right, I am technically an individual who has multiple disabilities. I just don't identify with that ever. And perhaps it's because it's newer. It's been over the last like 6 or so years. But I have multiple autoimmune disorders and, you know, pretty much your traditional depression and anxiety as well. So I do technically hold multiple disabilities, and I'm very grateful to work in a place that accommodates appropriately and compassionately, because I know that's not the case for everyone.
Yeah.
So bad news, there are 150 million children that we know about that have disabilities worldwide. This comes from UNICEF, so it's pretty accurate. And again, this is worldwide. This is not just in the United States. In our United States special education system, we serve over 7.3 million students. And that's as of the 2021 school year. So this could have gone up or down just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to mention that the special education system is in place because of the IDEA Act, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And what that does is essentially provide the services to educate young people 3 to 21 years of old or 21 years of age in our public education system in the United States. So there's about 15% overall students who are enrolled in our country's public schools with disabilities, which I feel like is it's a pretty significant number.
Yeah.
And of those students, about a third of them have what they call a specific learning disability. And that's going to be something like dyslexia. That just to give you an idea of what that might look like. That's the category they tend to like lump people into is, are you a specific learning disability? Do you have a speech or language impairment? Then they have this like other category and autism, and like these tinier categories happen as well. So the second most common disability we're going to see in young people in the United States is someone with a speech or language impairment. And that could be a variety of different things, but essentially getting the words out is difficult for whatever reason. It could be an anatomical reason. It could be a neurodiversity thing, but maybe they struggle to pronounce a certain word or certain letters. I know a friend of mine had a kid who had something with his tongue that they had to do like a little surgery, and that fixed the problem. But until it was, taken care of surgically, he had a speech impairment. The third most common category is that other category I mentioned, and those tend to be like chronic health conditions or long-term health issues, or young people who are going through cancer treatment or HIV treatment, things like that. So they're going to have, it's more a health looking at, less speech, less mobility, less neuro. It tends to be more like a physical health ailment that maybe they have asthma and they have to miss school all the time, or they can't go when it's cold outside, or those kinds of things. And then the fourth most common is going to be autism, and that's at 12% in the 2021 school year, which doesn't feel that big right now. But then I looked back at about 20 years, and in 2000, it was only 1.5%. Yeah. So
Wow.
only 1.5% of kids were diagnosed with autism in special ed 20 years ago, and now it's 12%. And I think that's a lot because we have awareness. We have, capabilities to screen kids younger. So we're finding the young people better, and we're able to provide support for them more quickly. So that's great. I think the autism levels were probably the same 20 years ago. We just weren't being able to find them and get them the help that they need.
Yeah. And I feel like we have so many more tools to be able to even serve young people with autism now.
Yeah. There's a variety of the like ABA therapy. I actually did that for a while when I was in high school. I worked with a young guy, Josh. He was great. He was autistic, and we did a lot of fun socializing things. So like one of my job was like, take out this amazing little dude to the mall and go ride the train, and like help him, like support him. So like with his social development, like did not feel like a job. It was just fun. Like I was just like babysitting is what it felt like.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's a great little guy. Well, he's not little anymore, but
I think sometimes when we're talking about people who are younger than us, we tend to be like, yeah, little, or even just our memory of that person.
That's what it is. He's stuck at 7. Like the last time I met him, he's 7 in my mind forever
he will
now.
always be 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you were saying, the numbers have increased, and perhaps that's because of awareness. Perhaps that's because we have better tools for screening, things like that. But the students with disabilities as a whole being served in public schools has jumped in the last 20 years, just like those autism numbers that Heather just shared. 40%, which is almost half of public schools, struggle to find educators for special education. And I think that really illustrates how difficult these positions are to keep staff there, to recruit staff who have the education, the experience they need in order to do their job, but also perhaps they also don't have the support. And so educators have reported feeling unprepared for how to effectively educate students with varying disabilities. And you can imagine, like it's not just one disability, right?
Yeah.
And like they have to tailor like what they're doing and how they're supporting
For
each student,
each
for
individual,
each student. Yeah. And like that's tough to, like, you can't be an expert in everything.
No, I mean, we speak publicly, we provide education, we do presentations, and we try to be aware of certain things, right? Like colors we're using, fonts we're using. We're trying to be as accessible to everyone, but we're not in doing ASL interpretation, right? I mean, and there's a variety of different things that we're just unable to do.
Yeah. Like the closed captioning,
Yeah.
like the transcript of our podcast.
Yeah.
Like we would do these things, but we do not have the capacity currently.
No.
Now, you know, the argument could be we need to make that a priority, which absolutely.
Sure.
I still do not have enough staff
Or funding to hire. Yeah.
To do it. Now we could make it into like an internship opportunity. Sure.
It's a lot of front loaded training.
It is. It's a lot of front loaded training. So again, like I think that's a capacity problem.
I think so too.
But I also think, I'm guessing schools run into that too.
I don't know how they couldn't, especially if you have a special ed classroom of, say, I don't know, 15 kids. Those are 15 different learners.
Yeah.
And they all need adaptations in some way to get the same information.
Right.
It feels honestly impossible with just like a couple of aides maybe and a teacher. And honestly, that would be a more well-staffed classroom if you had a couple of aides and a teacher with 15 kids. They're being asked something unaskable, I think. It's just unattainable. You're not going to be able to provide the perfect level of education and care for such a diverse population.
Right. And another worry educators have is about giving a disproportionate amount of time to their students with disabilities than those without. So they're holding these worries. They're trying to balance time. They're trying to tailor support and care. Like, it's just, they're asked a lot.
They're asked too much, truly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in a recent study, more than half of teachers said that they want more tech support for students with disabilities. So,
of course, that doesn't shock me.
Yeah, and if you can imagine being an educator without the tech supports in place in order to educate the students you have in your class, that's really frustrating too, because you know that you're not getting through in the best way possible to your student, and you just don't have what you need.
Yeah, we want you to accomplish this goal, but we're not going to give you the things you need to do it, and then we're going to be mad at you.
And that's just
that you're not accomplished. Yeah, it's absolutely unreasonable. It's a toxic work environment, I'm sure, in many cases.
Yeah.
I mean, educating right now as a whole for general ed is a struggle, and they're being asked to do too much. I can only imagine what the burden and the load on those special ed teachers is.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the paraprofessionals I know help, but we are in desperate need of them as well. We don't have the number of paraprofessionals that we need either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you know, and I think what we're saying leads into this next piece that, like, educators develop negative attitudes, which, okay, so if you think about HR and you think about even looking at a job description and looking at job responsibilities and being asked too much of, right? And like not being given the tools that you need to succeed in your job duties and things. It's no wonder that people like educators or anybody in this situation develop negative attitudes, right?
Yeah.
So they're developing negative attitudes toward educating students with disabilities because they don't feel supported in their work. So then I think resentment builds, and I think sometimes resentment is misplaced.
Sure. I mean, I feel like resentment often is in a variety of situations.
And sometimes, you know, like the students may bear the brunt of some of the frustration. And I mean, I understand it because that happens. But like these educators need so much support. They need like the tools in order to fulfill their job duties in the best way possible, so that because you want to go home at the end of each day and you're like, I did the best I could today.
Yeah.
Right.
I did more good than bad today.
Yeah.
I, reached some students, or we had, a success today. But like a lot of them, I'm sure, are going home with feeling they had no successes that day, and not at any fault to their person,
Right.
but because they had more students and not enough support
Right.
to do what they needed to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be livid. I know that the profession loses educators quite often, and I suspect this is why.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is our oppression or anti-oppression season. So we want to just make the connections to disability and marginalization and oppression. In doing some of this research, I put it into Google, right? Like oppression, disability. Like I just wanted to see what some of the things would come up. And like every single one said at like the first sentence was people with disabilities are one of the most marginalized populations in the United States, repeatedly, like site after site after site. And so then, of course, I mean, I was looking at information for this anyways, but I started looking into why is this like their leading statement? Essentially, it's because every single day, nearly every moment, they are facing barriers and obstacles that limit their ability to enjoy life in the way that they desire to. And a lot of their basic human rights are going unmet as a result of having a disability. Additionally, as someone with disability, some disability advocates have said they feel frustrated because they're constantly underestimated. People think they can't do certain things, and the problem is it's like, no, I absolutely can do those things. I need this accommodation or this aid or support or whatever. It's like I'm capable. That's not the problem. The problem is I don't have the things I need to access my abilities, essentially. Their needs are overlooked constantly. And some of this is intentional, I'm sure, but I think a lot of it is if you don't have a disability or a specific disability, you're not going to think of the ways you would need to accommodate for someone. I know Melissa was just at a great conference, a sex ed conference, and was taken aback essentially by the ASL and being a deaf person and trying to learn and teach sex ed. Did you want to say any more about that?
It was just really interesting because this was the opening keynote. And then I think, too, that's why it was so striking. I know my mind was blown, but this was given by a deaf person. And ASL interpretation was provided by the speaker. And we were receiving the interpretation through the interpreter.
Sure.
Which was striking. But,
yeah, because it's a different balance for sure.
Yeah.
Very cool, though.
Yes, very, very, very cool. But
yeah. Like you were mentioning before we started, like a handful of things that you just hadn't even thought of. And not because, again, not like you're a bad person. You just are not deaf or acquainted with the needs of people who have hearing disabilities.
Right. And like even mentioning that, you know, we received the speech through an interpreter, like that interpreter is interpreting what is being communicated to them, and so we are receiving the message through that filter. And to reverse that, like that, you know, this speaker, you know, when she was younger, she really wanted to be in sex ed. She was so excited, came into the, you know, front of the class, sat down, and her interpreter like didn't want to do some of the signs for what was being taught in sex ed that day because of the other kids. And it's like, nope. It's not for the other kids. This is
they're prioritizing
her education.
The other kids at this point.
Yeah, but then she was unable to receive the words or and that some of the words in sex ed, like ASL is constantly catching up. To our language. At least in English is what I can say. But like, and I think it should be said too that like, I think it's something that people consider a given that people who are deaf can just automatically read lips, but like they've never heard those sounds.
Yeah, depending on their hearing disability.
Right. And so it's just really tough. And there's so much more that I'd never considered. And I was like, my mind was blown open for accessibility, which is why I mentioned the transcript for the podcast and like all these things that and our social media with the content descriptions. Like these are things that like have been in the back of my mind, but I'm like, we just don't have the capacity. Right. But like, and I still think that, but like, I feel like I need to make sure I prioritize it somehow.
Yeah.
And I don't know what exactly that looks like in this moment.
Right.
But at least we're talking about it. And now it's at the front of our minds.
Yes. I think it just really illustrates how if we're not familiar, a close friend, a family member, or ourselves are not experiencing those particular types of disabilities, it is difficult to use a disability lens when you're applying really anything. Because truthfully, we should be able to adapt everything to meet the needs of people with disabilities. But in practice, that is very far from the truth. And again, it's a resource thing. It's a capacity thing. It's not oftentimes I don't think it's because people are like trying to make life harder for people with disabilities, but we can barely meet, our expectations as it is.
Sure. I think too, like, because we're saying, this is the most marginalized population. And we are going to be talking about how they are the most susceptible and vulnerable population. Susceptible sounds so wrong.
Well, vulnerable because of the marginalization, which is society's fault, not their fault.
Absolutely. That they are more likely by several times likely to be a victim of domestic or sexual violence. I'm just like, we've got to think about this as an agency. We've got to think about this better as a movement.
We do. And again, with a lot of the oppression and isms, the burden for change is placed on the person experiencing the oppression and marginalization, which is outrageous. We have under-resourced them. We have treated them like garbage. And now we're putting additional weight on them to educate and change society.
Right.
Also, like, figure out how to make your life, you're able to do things in your regular life, like just going to the doctor and cooking yourself food. But also, here's the burden of society marginalizing you. Yeesh.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear society doesn't prioritize people with disabilities. Repeatedly clear.
Yes.
We ran into an incident. There was a fire in a building with a group of folks that we work with a lot. And there are several disabled folks, like mobility disabled. They had wheelchairs, walkers. They couldn't do stairs, right? They're not on the first floor. They were on the third floor, the sixth floor, etc. And they were told to shelter in their units for a fire. And I guess what they would have done, if the fire had spread, was they would have done like this sort of slide thing that goes up to their window. And they would have to slide down,
How would they get to the window?
Well, I was thinking about one person in particular. She's in a wheelchair because she has severe stability issues. She gets dizzy and vertigo a lot. So I would be afraid she'd just fall out the window off the side of the slide. Yeah, these are the kinds of things that, really, really bother me. We shouldn't be worried that our friends with mobility issues are going to die in a fire because there's not an adequate escape route for them. And I don't want to get too into it, but there's got to be policies or something, but I can't imagine that building could pass inspections.
No.
So it's clear that it isn't prioritized, essentially. I'll try not to continue on that because I'm still very grumpy about it.
No, you should be. I mean, I'm also grumpy.
I know.
I'm just perplexed. I'm like, how in the world
I agree.
did this pass any inspection?
Yeah, because especially the number of folks who have mobility problems that are living in that building.
Yeah,
it's a big number. So we need to be doing something, and nobody is. Nobody's doing anything. So I want to talk about how they're routinely denied access to the same kind of support and opportunities that non-disabled folks are able to access. So things that I'm thinking of are like extracurricular activities, sports. Like your high school doesn't usually have like wheelchair basketball or adapted athletics in some way. Sure, there's Special Olympics, but that's some big like international, like you may not actually be able to participate in that. It is just not accessible. I don't think we have any community leagues or programs locally, like at the Y. I can't think of any, at least. So they're just constantly left out because we haven't considered how to include them. The links to oppression are also in our attitudes towards people and students with disabilities. Like we mentioned, the educators are having a hard time. And so some educators and caregivers are going to expect that their students with disabilities are going to be low achieving, that they are going to display inappropriate behaviors. And when other people are putting those expectations on you, especially as a young person, you tend to internalize those behaviors. So when we could actually be causing the low achieving, causing these self-esteem, self-worth issues just by these sort of these thoughts that educators, caregivers, etc. have. What else was I going to say? Oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Students with disabilities also have reported that they feel alienated by teachers and peers, which is heartbreaking. I understand peers. I don't think it's great, but I expect it, I guess. And in an education and like students all together, there are going to be kids who just don't get it, who aren't going to ask you to come play on the swings, etc., because they don't understand. They're kids. But the adults in those situations should really be working on being inclusive and adapting what they're doing so that we can let our kids with special needs or disabilities be included in all of the things their peers are included in.
Yeah, and I think, too, the adults can help facilitate that inclusion.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. I'm just thinking, like, I had a field trip when I was little. I was in 3rd grade, and we had a little girl who used a wheelchair. And she couldn't come on the field trip because where we were going, her wheelchair wouldn't be able to be used.
And the thing is like, I think if that's the case, then like you go where all of your students can go.
Oh, I agree with you. Yeah.
And belong.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But this was the field trip they did every year, and they weren't going to change it or adapt it for one student. I don't think that's right. But I understand why it happens when we don't have the support and resources available to the educators.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, and attitudes lead to behaviors, and we end up with things like bullying behaviors when there's not that connection or understanding of what another person is going through. And students with disabilities experience more bullying than their peers. Sadly, their vulnerabilities make them easy targets.
Yep.
And of course, this can cause long-term negative impacts to mental health, emotional health, and we know that mental health impacts physical health as well. So it just compounds not only health, but just like experiencing bullying like that hurts.
It's going to harm your self-worth and your self-esteem.
Yeah.
It's going to make achieving academic goals more difficult for anyone, whether you have a disability or not. If you're being bullied, you're not going to like be as successful as you might have been without that bullying impacting your mental health.
Right. And that bullying, right? So the definition that we operate under is that, the person is it's unfair, one-sided, and it keeps happening. So this is like more than once, right?
Yes.
This is a pattern of abuse, just like domestic violence is a pattern of abuse, and it's on purpose. And so like this isn't just like your one-off, like you say something horrible, oops, sorry, and then you do better. Like that's not what we're talking about. just this ongoing stuff. And so again, like this is trauma upon trauma. So this is like, I use the word compounded. I'm not really sure if that's what I'm looking for, but it's just on top of each other. And like one trauma can remind you of the last trauma, you know? And so it's just, and you can see why this would commonly cause negative outcomes at school. And this would increase absenteeism. You know, when you don't want to go somewhere because you're going to be bullied, like you're going to struggle. You might be acting out as a young person because you don't want to go, or like, and becoming as like a caregiver might see like more difficult.
Yeah.
To get out the door or whatever it is. It's just, it is heartbreaking. I know we keep using that word, but it is. So in order to reduce the stigma, it's important to integrate students with disabilities into regular education. Like the more exposure someone has, the more they can connect with that person, the more understanding can increase, and you become more familiar with that person and get to know their needs and how you can be a part of that rather than outside of it. Like it's not thinking, oh, I don't have what they need, so I can't help them.
Right.
So why be in relationship with them? It's like, no, like, why don't you get to know them and see how you fit together?
Absolutely.
But I can see why people stay away, like back off, because they don't know.
Yeah, and especially with young people, there's a fear of the unknown.
Yes.
And like we need to start encouraging young people to be curious and kind when they are confronted with people with disabilities, right? Like, I know I saw some meme, you know, a mom was in the store, somebody was using a wheelchair, and the kid said, "Mom, why is that person in a wheelchair?" And the mom said, "Well, you can ask them if they'd like to talk about it with you." And so the little kid was just like, "Hey, can I ask you why you're in a wheelchair?" And the person was like, "Oh yeah, go ahead." And they had a little discussion and everybody walked away feeling seen, as well as like now this young person has a new set of skills and is going to think about that interaction in the future.
Absolutely.
You know?
Oh, I love that.
It was such a short little thing. It was probably 3 minutes in the grocery store.
Yeah.
It impacted everyone's life that day in a positive way.
Yeah. Oh, I love that spirit of curiosity.
Yeah.
And that curiosity, that this integration can reduce the amount of bullying students with disabilities face. And like we said, this benefits everyone. The peers who are not identifying as disabled. It's impacting them as well.
It's an empathy building practice.
Yeah.
It is a compassion building practice. I would say it's even a problem solving practice, particularly in like, how do I get my friend with these special needs integrated into my play or my activity, right? So now the kids themselves are even trying to think about workarounds. How do we do this? How do we do that? Like you're also learning problem solving in addition to these other things.
Yeah.
It's so beneficial.
Have you ever seen a dance done on stage where like they are incorporating people with disabilities or people in wheelchairs?
I haven't.
It's beautiful.
I'm sure.
There's some really cool things that can be done.
But that's the thing, right? Like I haven't even seen it, didn't even know it existed. We should have more of these things front and center.
Yeah.
Because then people feel seen. They don't feel alienated. They don't feel isolated. And isolation is a tool of abuse and a tool of oppression. Mm-hmm. Because when you are cut off, when you are isolated, you don't know what other opportunities might be out there. You don't have connections to provide support. And that's going to affect you in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
We always say, you know, isolation is one of the things that an abusive individual will do to keep someone from leaving an unhealthy and abusive relationship. Mm-hmm. And this kind of oppression of people with disabilities is the exact same thing. It's just a larger scale. It's a huge population of human beings rather than one person in a household.
Wow.
So of course, kids with disabilities face a lot of alienation and isolation in pretty much every area of their life. I'm thinking if your kid in your wheelchair isn't going to be able to go out and play in the snow and make snow angels and run around and those kinds of things. And I think using a wheelchair in the snow can be pretty difficult if you don't have the right modifications to your wheelchair.
Yep.
So like just one instance, like there's somebody, looking out the window, watching all the neighborhood kids building snowmen, and they're stuck inside. And again, not because of any other reason except for the fact that they have a disability. That's going to cause a lot of unpleasant and negative feelings within oneself and can really damage mental health if this is a consistent thing. And at schools, depending on the school, they may not have opportunities even to interact with the other kids. Because depending on, are they in full special ed classrooms? Are they in regular ed? If they're in special ed, a lot of times they're not interacting with the rest of the school. They're doing things on a different schedule. Yeah. I've seen schools where they're like a whole wing is just special ed. So there's no regular ed kids there at all.
Right.
Of course, that's going to increase alienation. It's going to increase misinformation. Mm-hmm. It is going to encourage bullying when you are isolating a group of people on purpose. Well, of course, that's going to lead to bullying. Kids are fantastic at finding ways to be mean to each other, but it's so obvious that it causes more harm than good. And then I was also thinking about like the programming for kids with disabilities. I was listening to a podcast today about someone who is a wheelchair user who is at UC Berkeley. And they have like one of the best disability education programs. Their campus is not made for people with wheelchairs. They have spaces they can't access. They can't go to events. There are a whole host. She was just like listing all the things. And this is supposed to be an institution that is more forward thinking and more inclusive. I know. So like, I can only imagine that across, our public schools that are funded, even more poorly than the University of California in Berkeley, which is a very well-funded institution,
right?
With adults who can advocate for themselves, unlike small children who don't know how or don't even know that they are allowed to.
Right.
So another one I just wanted to mention, this is something that for us is particularly important, is a lot of the special ed kids are left out of healthy relationship and sex education courses, which is something we go into classes to do. We don't have a program or a curriculum developed for young people. There's something developed specifically for adults with intellectual disabilities, but there is not something developed for young people.
Yeah, we pretty much have to outsource that. Yep. And like just kind of bring some resources together. We're going to be bringing some people together. I think that I mentioned that like a couple
I think so.
episodes ago, something I was excited about, but like, yeah, just bringing special ed teachers and life skills teachers together and social workers and health teachers. Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to get these body safety lessons to the students in your classes? Because right now, like, I don't feel like we have the tools or experience to get them the message they need and the way they need it.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's the same thing that the classroom teachers are facing too with all of their curriculums, not just, sex ed, which is what we are looking at.
Right. So as you can imagine, with a lot of these barriers and because they are experiencing oppression, like there's an economic impact here. According to the UNICEF report, poverty is both a cause and a consequence. And we know this, right? Like, poverty is one of the root causes of oppression, but it's also a consequence of the systems in place.
It feeds itself almost.
Yeah.
How do you break out of a cycle that feeds itself? Yeah, exactly.
It's like something revolutionary.
We just stared at each other.
Like, yeah. Well, I think that, do you remember like the Occupy movement and everything like that? Like I feel like that was trying to really upset some systems. And it's like, I don't know, just like stuff like that, just it feels like it peters out. Like,
it does.
Because people get tired. So tired.
Yep. And the people that are putting in the work are the ones that have been harmed and are being harmed. So they're going to be tired and exhausted and broken down more quickly. Well, because they started with less, energy and oomph behind them on account of the other things they're already navigating.
Yeah. Yeah. So youth with disabilities experience higher rates of poverty than their peers. So
for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah. And then you have the caregivers of the youth with disabilities, which, depending on how much care an individual needs, they may have given up their job in order to stay at home and care for their young person. So caregivers may have to sacrifice paid work. And the additional supports and healthcare needs can be very expensive.
Yep.
Perhaps not covered by insurance.
A lot of them aren't, yeah.
That's draining.
Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
So, like, you may already be struggling financially, and then it's like, well, here's all these medical bills. Here are all these things that will help your child succeed, but they're not covered by insurance. They aren't free. So now you have more expenses. And of course, if there are hospital bills or medical bills that are included, wheelchairs are not cheap. Things that work well and are easy and are adapted to youth and young people or different environments, those are going to be expensive. And kids grow out of these, actual like physical support or mobility type aid things. Their bodies are going to grow and they're going to need new ones all the time, just like clothes. So yeah, the financial burden is extremely heavy on households with folks that have disabilities.
Mm-hmm. And then you think about just the way in which, we were talking about the education in the classrooms and perhaps not having the tools we need to educate them in the way they need. And then, as you say, right, they grow. They grow into adults with disabilities. And then they may have more difficulty finding a job that pays a living wage because maybe they haven't had the chance to even have the education and skills built up that they could have gotten if the educators had the tools. I don't know.
Yeah, I again, in that podcast, she talked about retention rates at the college. The lowest retention rates were students that identified as having disabilities. So now
because of the accessibility and like lack of accommodations. Yep. Yeah, that makes total sense.
And that's in higher ed. Like that's absolutely happening in high school. So you may have students who aren't finishing school. And then that's a huge barrier to getting wage jobs or paid jobs. And I'm thinking of things like fast food, right? That's where a lot of that's going to be.
Right.
That may not be an option based on the person's, disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Or grocery store clerk.
Like a whole bunch of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or how do they get to work? Exactly. Like if they don't have a vehicle that's adapted to whatever their needs are, or they're unable to drive as a result. Now we also have to find them transportation, make sure they get to and from work.
Right.
It's hard for them to find and maintain a job that pays enough for them to live off of. And again, no fault of their own.
No.
So let's put together some of these pieces, the disability piece, the oppression and marginalization piece, and look at how that increases risk of abuse. And when we're talking about higher risk, I want to remind everyone, this is, again, not the fault of the individual. The stigma, the discrimination, and the oppression are what have increased these folks' risk of abuse. So stigma, powerlessness, isolation, anytime we have all of these things together in such high numbers, you're going to see higher experiences of abuse in that particular population. And this isn't really a lot different when we're talking about abuse risk in young people for adults. They are both at higher risk of experiencing abuse. anytime we have a vulnerability, whatever that might be, it could be a disability. It could be someone who grew up in the foster care system. It could be someone who has really low self-esteem or self-worth. Those are vulnerabilities. Abusive individuals see that as an easy person to abuse because they can exploit that vulnerability and manipulate them in ways they might not be able to with someone who has a different or lesser vulnerability.
Right. And so abuse can occur anywhere, at school, at home, at care centers and institutions, or on the streets. As you can imagine, many people with disabilities are homeless.
I mean, you've seen
experiencing homelessness. Yeah. Those living in care centers or institutions are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Like they depend on the people caring for them in these facilities, and this is like their main home. Obviously, they're going to be bathing here. They're going to be
in the bathroom.
They're living here.
Yeah.
Like they're having relationships here. And then people with disabilities may experience forms of abuse that occur at higher rates for people with disabilities or the elderly. And so this would include things like stealing or withholding Social Security disability checks, invalidating or minimizing a disability. Like, for instance, someone says like, oh, you're just faking that. Like, you don't really have a problem doing this thing. Like, you just want to get out of it. Or, like this is just an excuse.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which that's
very that harmful. Invisible disability kind of thing.
Yes.
When you can't see it. Well, I mean, if you can't see it, you can't support it in any way. But also, you're just not aware. And unless you're wearing a badge or like a shirt that says, hey, I have this disability, people just aren't aware, so they can't appropriately support you.
Sure. I would hope that once the person discloses that they don't hear, nah.
I hope so, but as a person who has an invisible illness, that's not really the case. Even the medical profession will say things like, oh, it's all in your head, or your blood work looks fine, so you must be fine. Like, there's a whole lot of medical trauma, I think, and medical abuse that these folks experience as well.
Yeah, and that really impacts them mentally.
How could it not?
Yeah. Yes. So some other forms of abuse that may be experienced at a higher rate includes sexual abuse related to being unable to provide verbal consent, withholding, damaging, or destroying assistive devices or medications, threatening to out your disability to others if it's a non-visible or disability or it carries some kind of social stigma, which, threatening to out people, that carries across so many marginalized identities. So I guess it's unsurprising that it's here on this list, but it's just so sad, like that knowledge is used over, which that's part of bullying, right? Yeah. It's using power over to your advantage. Yep.
I'm thinking someone who has, say, a personality disorder, and sometimes that carries a negative stigma with it, the personality disorder. So like I could see a partner saying, well, I'm going to tell your work that you have borderline personality disorder, or that you have been diagnosed as a narcissist or whatever. Like, that could be very damaging. It shouldn't be, but it can be.
Yes. Thanks for sharing that. So two more forms that I'm going to mention today are harming or threatening to harm your service animal, which, I
can't. I just can't even.
Yeah. But this is something that's common in domestic violence.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Like whether you have a disability or not, this is a reason why many people stay in abusive relationships or abusive home lives is because they have threatened to harm their animal.
Yeah.
And they can't take, perhaps like whatever their safety plan is to get out of that situation, like maybe they can't take the animal with them. Yeah. And so they're deciding to stay because they can't take the animal.
I've actually been speaking with a survivor who's not in our service area, who's been in shelter somewhere else without her service dog.
Oh my gosh.
Because they can't support her service dog in the shelter. Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah. Big time yikes. again, outside of our service area.
Right. Okay.
So it's unfortunate like that we aren't able, because that's not something that we
legal?
would do. I don't know if it's legal or not. I don't think it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't know what the situation, I don't know more about the background, but I do know that we've been providing her with some over the phone support, because imagining how hard that could be.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, and so this abuse, again, not surprising that it's on this list, but it's horrific, like harming or threatening to harm your service animal. So that's just like a whole nother level.
Yep.
Of like, that's an extension of you that's helping, like you were talking about earlier, Heather, like the tools to be able to access your abilities, right? And so that's the service animal for you. And then if you're threatening to harm that, you are threatening my autonomy.
You're essentially threatening my person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like that's an extension of me.
Even more so than it is. We see in abusive household, partners will threaten, pets that are not service animals. Yeah. And that's still a huge, it's gut wrenching and people stay. Even more so if the animal is a service animal and helps you with your daily living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then using your disability to justify an abusive partner's behavior.
Yeah.
Like
if you weren't so hard to deal with.
Exactly.
I wouldn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
Cool. Great. So I'm going to give you a little bit of data that's going to be hard to swallow here. Children with disabilities are more than 3 times as likely to experience abuse. It increases to 4 times as likely if the children are living in care homes. And the abuse can be a variety of things, such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, maltreatment, emotional, verbal, digital, of course. Like the list goes on, but it's not limited to like one particular method or type of abuse. And we know as many as 68%, so more than 2/3 of women, adolescents with intellectual disabilities are abused before they reach the age of 18. So more than half of the females with disabilities experience some form of abuse before they get to 18. Children that are nonverbal or have a hearing deficit or deaf have some of the highest rates of abuse amongst children with disabilities. And this is for a couple reasons. One, they cannot usually provide verbal consent, and reporting would be extra difficult for them if they're nonverbal or they have hearing disabilities. And I also want to mention, and I know we say this all the time, these statistics are just what we know of. These are just the numbers that someone filled out a survey or there was a report or they got help somewhere. For the people that aren't reporting and aren't help seeking, they're not counted in this data. And we know for abuse, that's pretty common. We don't see a lot of, we see much smaller numbers of reporting that are actually occurring out in the real world.
And I just wanted to point out too, I think it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 female adolescents before the age of 18 are like that's
like
statistic
33%.
We know. Yeah. For like child sexual abuse, right? And you said as many as 68%,
if not more. Yeah, like that's the low end of that guess. Mm-hmm.
So you can see even in those numbers, how much more likely.
I'd say it's probably more like 75 to 80%. Oh. But again, that's a guess. Right. Because we don't have the reports. We're just knowing how many people have disabilities.
And as you said, it's even more likely to happen if they're in care homes. And we know that it's like any form of abuse is more likely to happen with somebody you know.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And any institutionalized setting, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. So why? Why are they abused at such high rates? Their reports of abuse are often dismissed or seen as not reliable. They're not believed. And this works to an abusive person's advantage. Perhaps they have a communication barrier and they don't have the tool they need, or maybe it's been taken away from them. So or maybe like with a physical, like a mobility disability, they might not be able to reach the phone, like it's been taken away.
Yeah, placed in a place in a space they can't access.
Right. Children who need assistance with tasks like using the toilet or washing are exceptionally vulnerable to abuse. There's just more opportunity. Janine Sanders mentioned this in our interview with her last season, and she is currently working on a book to adapt body safety rules for those with disabilities.
As a result of her daughter's position, right? Her adult daughter works with children with disabilities and brought this, to light to Ginny. And she was like, as Janine does, she was like, well, I'm going to do something about it.
That's right. So, I'm going to write a book. Yeah. Like that's how she teaches is through stories.
We're very excited for when that comes out.
Absolutely. Yes. And as you can imagine too, like with these barriers, children and youth with disabilities may not be able to defend themselves or recognize the abuse as not okay. Maybe they've been taught by their abusers that this is just normal behavior, like this is what is okay and expected in relationships between authority figures and children and youth, and that they have to comply.
Yeah. I mean, we do that to little kids anyways.
Yeah.
You listen to the adults. You do what the adults say. Like we don't say that because we know that's a great way for abuse to be covered up. But I think that in a lot of cases, especially when they have like caregivers that come into the home, like professional caregivers,
right?
They're just taught you comply. You do what they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And caregivers experience higher levels of stress when providing care to kids with disabilities. And I think it's because of the things that we've mentioned about not having the tools and resources to complete the job duties. I think it's less the person that they're caring for.
No, totally.
And more,
it's the structure of society that makes them stressed.
Right.
And we just don't, if everything was accessible and they had all this help, their level of stress would be much lower.
Yeah.
And then, of course, anytime you are more stressed, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to blow up or you're going to do unhealthy behaviors that hurt someone.
Yeah. And then on top of that, too, why are people with disabilities abused at much higher rates? They have multiple marginalized identities, and the more marginalized identities that you stack upon each other, the rates of abuse go up.
Yep.
And women report more experiences of abuse. So a girl with disabilities has increased risk of, because of her gender, because of her disability status. But again, like this is because our statistics that we have are showing that women are reporting. Men might be reporting, but maybe at lower rates. And there's other things connected with that too. Yeah. I know we haven't really discussed that on this podcast.
No, we haven't.
But, again, like a stigma on top of all of these barriers that they face.
Sure. And like if they have a marginalized ethnicity, perhaps, they are Latinx, maybe they are a member of the LGBTQIA+. Like that just keeps increasing the likelihood that they are going to experience abuse.
Yes, and I know that when we talked with the LGBTQIA+ youth, we discovered that a lot of their exploration came from having some kind of neurodiversity or some kind of disability that they were exploring and navigating. And they were exploring their gender identity or sexual orientation at the same time. And it was so linked. And I don't think, I certainly didn't expect that. I guess
I didn't either.
My brain was expanded that day that we talked with them.
Yeah. The last few years, really, because of the work that we do here, I have seen more of this. I'm queer and I'm neurodiverse. I would love to explore more. I think it's very cool.
Yeah.
I'm sad that that means they're going to experience more oppression, but I love the way that their brains are working.
Yes.
And I'm very curious, and I wish we had time to speak more specifically with young people experiencing or who are LGBTQIA+, as well as have some sort of disability as well.
Yeah.
But we are only two people.
I know.
So I wanted to mention before we finish up here that seeking help for abuse is also riddled with obstacles and barriers for folks that have disabilities. If you're a child, there's already more obstacles. Kids really struggle with reporting for a variety of reasons. A lot of times they don't want to upset their caregivers by telling them about the abuse because they have compassion and empathy for their caregivers, and they're putting their caregivers before themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there's already a barrier if it's a child, which we work on as educators. The first time I heard you say it was, what happens if that adult doesn't believe you? You go to the next adult, And I'm just like, I hate that we have to teach kids that.
I know.
I'm glad we do because it's needed, but it just bums me out.
You know what bums me out even more?
What?
Is that they have a backup plan already.
Yeah.
They had an answer for me.
Yeah.
They've already thought about this, of what's going to happen if this adult doesn't believe me, because they were already like, go to the next one. I'm like, yeah, I'm glad you know that, but like, I'm sad that you've already had to create a backup plan in your head because you had that answer ready.
I know. Because I'm sure in other instances, there have been things where they're like, so-and-so, took my pencil and, they're like, well, you tend to lie. We're not,
And I hear that from teachers all the time.
I do too. I heard it from the DCFS workers. That child tends to tell stories.
Oh, yeah. I remember one DCFS worker talking to me after us.
That's what I was thinking
Advocacy
of.
Center interview. And I was like, we believe survivors here at Safe Journeys. Like, I don't know how to respond to that. Like,
the amount of times we have to say that is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I know in our world that is a given, but it's not in the rest of the world. And it is so anger inducing.
Oh, absolutely.
There are so few things that cause me rage. That's one of them.
Yeah. Well, it enrages me that we even have to have a Start by Believing campaign. I'm like, why? But then I'm like, oh, right. Because you guys can't even handle starting by believing.
Right. And I think that speaks then to how much more difficult it's going to be for a young person with a disability.
Absolutely.
It's difficult for a young person without a disability. The disability is an added layer.
Yep.
So a lot of times they're going to have to report to some sort of authority figure or care provider, which in itself is hard and can be scary depending on the child and the caregiver. They don't want to upset someone that they care for, like I had just mentioned. And most people think children are unreliable. Before this position, I would have agreed. I don't agree anymore. I do see them playing with the truth, if you will. But I think that is in normal developmental stage as well. But when it comes to abuse, I always am going to believe a child.
Yes. Even
if they're a whole room of adults and caregivers are going, it's not true, I'm still going to believe that child. And what's the risk of me believing them? It's just not there isn't a risk. There's no risk factors that are increased because I believe this child. Anyways, sorry, I got a little grumpy. So like I said, lots of kids with disabilities have increased barriers. And then there may be specific barriers related to a disability. Like we talked about with deaf children or children that are hard of hearing or nonverbal. They may not communicate well with other folks. They may not be able to access services that are provided in ASL, or perhaps they require Braille, resources, all sorts of things. We don't have them. I don't think we have a Braille resource.
Well, I think we have some sex ed
Braille
resources actually, but it's older. But I also want to mention too, like, add on top of all of this, like some intersections of like immigrating from another country or being a refugee or seeking asylum.
Which we're seeing obviously so much of.
And coming here and having a disability like being deaf or hard of hearing, like you don't know ASL yet. So what are you going to do now?
Right.
Like, and that's where you need somebody like a deaf interpreter to help through that. But it's like, but again,
it's just challenge on top of challenge.
Yeah. And paying that person, it's the resources. But yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So that brings us to our conclusion for today. We're going to share our media we love, which is the book that I mentioned by Janine Sanders called Included. And it's a book for all children about inclusion, diversity, disability, equality, and empathy. And it focuses on showing kids that everyone is valuable and has worth. And it really seeks to help reduce negative stereotypes of people with disabilities. And we don't get kickbacks, I swear, from promoting Janine Sanders' books. And she's probably smiling. She's going to listen to this since we'll tag her.
Oh, for sure.
Shamelessly. But we adore Janine Sanders, and we just are so grateful for all of the work that she does and the tools that she puts out there, because this is stuff that educators can use.
She makes it easy.
Yeah.
She really does.
Which is fabulous. Like, this is what we need. Yeah. Like, I would feel more comfortable being able to take that book and teach from it so that I would be able to give those body safety lessons.
Well, and she has all these amazing additional resources on her site that support many of the books, like discussion questions, posters. It is so beneficial. Yeah. And we cannot say her name enough, because we just want all the people to get her stuff and be able to use it and educate and keep kids safe.
Yes. So in a nutshell, we love you, Janine.
We do.
We thank you all for listening today, and encourage you to keep listening for any resources you may need.
Look out for new podcasts every other Monday on anywhere that you can find your podcasts. Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Anchor FM, you name it. We're there. If you have any questions, and we would love to hear from you, you can email us at saferjourneyspod@safejourneysillinois.org. You can also message us on social media. We have a Facebook and an Instagram that you can find us at. And let's talk about some resources for anyone who's experiencing abuse. If you happen to live in and around LaSalle or Livingston County in Illinois, please feel free to call Safe Journeys support line at 815-673-1555. 24/7, confidential, services are free. If you don't happen to be in our area, there are 2 national hotlines that you can call for support. For sexual violence, you can call RAIN with 2 N's. That's the National Sexual Violence Hotline. Their phone number is 800-656-HOPE. They also have a live chat on their website if you're interested. And for domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, you can call the hotline, which is simply thehotline.org. And this is our national domestic violence hotline. And you can give them a call at 800-799-SAFE or chat live on the website. Thanks for listening.